Thank you so much. I hope that some of you will understand if I speak Slovak. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor for us to be able to hold this Central European Forum in Pistorius Palace. This palace was closed for 12 years. It was in a very poor condition, and we in Via Cultura decided to reopen it. It still has its Venetian charm. It means that you did not come to refurbished premises, but before somebody decides to refurbish the building, I believe this is a very good location in the center of town. There is also a movie hall from 1950s, so you can travel back in time to the 1950s, and you can also come to see a spectacle given by our friends, our handicapped theater company, and you can also visit various exhibitions that are presented here. Currently, there is an exhibition on lost generation. It is a generation of 20 to 30 years old young people, and my generation finds it difficult to understand why they consider themselves to be a lost generation, but we let them use the building, so please do not touch the exhibits. And I thank you for your attention. I wish you a very pleasant stay here, and you can try to imagine Mr. Pistori, who was a very old Central European, well-known pharmacist, and he was well known not only in Bratislava but also in various other areas. Due to the beautiful garden attached to the building, but then this palace was taken over by by Nazis, and they had their headquarters in this building, and Mr. Pistori was then executed as a war criminal. So you may see that there is a number of ghosts walking along these halls, but later on the palace was taken over and made into the Lenin Museum. If you look out the window, you can see a statue of Lenin. It's the only one that remained here in Bratislava, and it's wrapped in paper, but there is an inscription, "I'll be back." With this, I would like to hand over to Filip Radonevich, who is Philip will say a few words concerning the topic of this year's Central European Forum, which is entitled "The Place for Citizens." So his opening presentation will deal with the issue of citizenship.
For my ignorant knowing of the Slovak language. I'll speak in English. Although I do understand pretty well Slovakian and Czech language. I'm originally coming from Montenegro, and I'm working since 2008 in the Erste Foundation, and I somehow surpassed through the 80s and 90s the turmoils which happened on the Balkans, and I've been a witness of also the political changes here, although from a much younger perspective. I was asked by our chairwoman of the board, Dora Eberle, to come tonight and somehow show the reasons and present somehow from my personal perspective and also from the perspective of the Foundation the importance of the Central European Forum. And it's very simple. We are the partners from the very first day. We are supporting this initiative for 5 years, and we have the privilege not only to be project partners, but we also became very close friends with the founders and initiators. The reason was also quite unique because we understood, or we had the very basic understanding that the changes which happened in 1989, I mean, the decades before and the 2 decades after that, have had a very huge impact on our lives in terms of the big changes which somehow brought the economic, the political, and artistic discourse into a totally another dimension. What does it really mean, this another dimension? It means that we live today through that our values, which we have believed that they've been set deeply rooted in our system, that they have undergone a very, very dramatic change, and that this change somehow is still implying our lives, implying from the perspective that we have had a war in the Balkans. We have had now we have political leaders who somehow are the results of these wars. We have our visionaries, I'm quoting, I mean, just under quotation marks, visionaries, which are somehow former reformed communists, which are former nationalists, and somehow those people don't represent the authentic discourse which most of you here, the former dissidents, were fighting for in your lives. And we realized that this importance was this kind of meetings were initiated to bring this critical discourse of the 70s, 80s back into a new revival, that we somehow have the possibility to meet and exchange. And I'm talking, when I say we, the younger generation, to exchange with you, to exchange with the older generations, to learn from your experience, and to ask ourselves where are today the Schumanns, the Adenauers, the Havels of today, and where are those of tomorrow? Because we do have a big and strong, and when I say we, I mean also the European Union in general, and the continent which is not divided anymore in East and West, but North and South. And I'm talking about a clear lack of political vision. And the Central European Forum is one of those places which maybe gives ideas, solutions, especially with this year's topic, active citizenship and the perspective of citizenship. So the main question, I think, should be how do citizens can translate and articulate their ideas, their visions, and their power into the political discourse. And this is one of the places, one of the very few places where we might get some answers on tonight's panel and the next 2 days. I have to really thank personally Martin Milan for their great engagement, but also Thomas and all the other people who somehow brought this event into a very living space tonight. And I have also to say that there are dozens of those young volunteers every year who do a great, wonderful job, and they have also to be mentioned. And I hope that we from Erste Foundation in future will also have the possibility to work with you, which was really great honor. And I'm always looking in the back because you're always hiding, like you have to hide something, but actually you should be here in the front because you're bringing all of us together, and this is a really great honor from me, from the younger generation as well, and also from you, from the elder generation who are bringing us the ideas which somehow nowadays seem to be forgotten, but they did not definitely lose a piece of their importance. In that sense, I would like to wish you a pleasant evening, and it's an honor to be tonight with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Filip. Na záver
And to conclude this opening address, I would like to hand over to Karl Schwarzenberg, who is our greatly esteemed guest.
Vážená paní Bašáriová,
Madam Bashariova, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to be invited here, to be here with you. I always like to come to Bratislava because I feel like a federal clerk, civil servant, and I still don't view Slovakia as abroad, as a foreign country, I must admit. This Central European Forum is an event which reminds me of what happened in Prague a few months ago. In Prague, I said that in contrast to what we claim and sometimes believe that we are a part of Western Europe, I said, unfortunately, it's not true. Even in November '89, our countries didn't move a millimeter westwards. We are what we are, Central Europeans, countries, nations with different history than Western culture. The basic difference compared to the Netherlands, England, France, is the reforms. Their reforms started bottom up. In our countries, reform always started from the top to the bottom. Yes, enlightened rulers like Maria Theresa, Joseph II, and others, we had reforms in our economy, like the one which we experienced during a new absolutist government. And even if we look at recent reforms in the last 20 years, we see efforts which come from the governments, be it the Minister of Finance or the Prime Ministers. They were always the people who pushed the reforms, and that is a fundamental difference on in the perception of the world in Central Europe. And it's also our weakness, be it Austria, be it Slovakia, Hungary, the Czech Republic. The point is that we always sit and wait, expect the help coming from the state. We never take the initiative in order to improve the situation. So this is, in my view, our weakness, and we sometimes really have to pay for it. What we expect is that it is a state that will resolve, tackle, address our problems, and when a government fails, then in that moment, we are listening more to populists and demagogues. That is also a common feature of this region, and the developments support my claim. We should realize that we are free today, we have freedom, but Thomas Garrigue Masaryk used to say, so we have now democracy, what we miss are Democrats, and that is what is our situation. What we miss is a strong civil society. That is what we miss. I remember very well 30 years ago, beginning of Reagan's government, I was in California. I visited the security advisor to President Reagan, and he told me, come with me, I have a local meeting, maybe you'll be interested. What was it? It was a gathering of local people, and they spoke about the protection of the national park. They didn't sit and wait till the government of California or the governor of California is going to do something about it. No, they have decided this is an area which needs to be protected, and so they took action. Can you imagine something like that in this region here? No, no, we even handed it over to Brussels, so we are not deciding almost about anything. And that is the difference between Western and Eastern Europe. And this is our deficit, and that is something we must face and address, because democracy needs sufficient number of Democrats and people realizing that their savior is not going to be the government if we want to have democracy. That is my knowledge, the experience, my conclusion of the last 10 days. We have a lot of common features, be it in culture, music, literature. All that is very important. And there we have a lot of in common, and we are strong in that field, but I think that we have weaknesses in our political capacities. In future, Central Europe will survive and will need to help each other. We see that candidate countries help each other and they pursue common policy regardless whether they are in the EU or not. Take Norway, or whether they are in NATO, take Sweden, but Finland, Norway, Denmark will always help each other. Sweden will help each other. This is one example. Another example is Benelux. They pursue also a common policy in Brussels, and that is something we must learn. We must learn that smaller countries, Poland is though a large country, but all the other countries are smaller countries, and Poland also suffered the same history as we here, and the consequence of that history is that we are a bit poorer than the West. And therefore, I think we should realize in a better way our Central European identity, and we should know what is our fate, what is our history, and we should not claim to be something we are not. And we are not a part of Eastern Europe. There were such efforts, but we are not a part of it, and these efforts were even more tragic. And I think the time is mature now to realize who we are, where we are, what is our legacy, what is our positive legacy, and we must face it, we must cope with it in the nearest future. Thank you very much.
Dámy a páni, zatiaľ, čo sa usadia,
Ladies and gentlemen, before our panelists come to their places on the podium, I would like to inform you that Viktor Yerofeyev, who has been supposed to speak, was not able to come because he has heart problems and he's been hospitalized. We are very sorry about it.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great privilege to host this panel. You know the subject, and you know the subject is not easy, not known in reality, and it's not easy to understand and to explain, but we'll try. So a difficult job is ahead. Well, the problem of civic activities is the crucial taste for any democratic society. And wondering what's going on this field here in the Eastern and Central Europe, we must remember that problem with citizens is not only East European problem these days. At least since the famous book Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, which has been published like 15 years ago or something like that, we know that civic activity, civic responsibility, presence of citizens in public life is decreasing in entire West. And on this general problem, we have our East European problem put on. What is our East European problem? In my opinion, there's a lack of civic activities coming from this disgusting propaganda in communist times, which was repeatedly explaining us we must be active, we must be citizens, we must join activities organized by Communist Party. And whoever remembers it feels that this kind of activities, which are in any way similar to those in previous times, is something not nice, not aesthetic. It's at least not good. Well, how to overcome these two problems? The new wave of problems concerning civic activities coming from the evolution of the West and the legacy of socialism. And to understand this, I believe we must not put all this stuff into one kettle, because when we say Eastern and Central Europe, we put in one kettle very different experiences of different countries, of smaller and bigger nations. In some of them there was underground opposition between 89, very active and massive, and some not. Cultural experience, for example, even in country like Poland, within Poland, historical experience is heavily different. I mean, this part that belonged to Austro-Hungarian Empire has different experience, social experiences, bigger social activities in the 19th and the beginning of 20th century. And this part that belonged to Russia has totally different experience. And this part that used to belong to Prussia has different experience. So even if in one country we have so big differences in historical experiences, what kind of differences must be existing in different countries like South European Croatia and East European Bulgaria, for example, or Romania or whatever. Well, I would turn now to, let me introduce panelists now, and then we will start our debate. Macy Shore is a professor at Yale University. She's an author of a book, Taste of Ashes, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism in Eastern Europe. I will try to use your experience. Slavenka Drakulic comes from Croatia. She's, among others, an author of Cafe Europe, Life After Communism, and we'll try to refer to this book as well. Peter Sterhazy comes from Hungary, and he's one of the most important Hungarian intellectuals and writers. Rudolf Chmel comes from Slovakia, as most of you know. It's something very strange for Paul to introduce Rudolf Chmel to Slovakia audience, I must say. But there are people from other countries, so I will explain. He's a literary scholar and also well-established politician in Slovakia. Well, I will try to turn at the beginning to Marcia Shore. And I will ask you as academic, as in this field, would you please describe these differences in the situation of civic activities, society, in different East European countries? Could we start with this short academic lecture, please?
Short academic lecture, okay. Well, thank you. Let me first of all also say thank you to Marta and to Tomasz and to the organizers. I'm very happy to be back in Bratislava. 4 years ago, I was on a panel with Slavenka at the Central European Forum devoted to revisiting 1989, and it was one of the most enjoyable and stimulating conferences I've ever been to. I'm an academic, so I go to lots of conferences, and usually people get up and read their own papers, and there's not a real conversation. And Central European Forum is one of the only places I found that actually cultivate the kind of the art of conversation. I should also say that the title of my recently published book was taken from the title of the panel that Slavenka and I were on, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism, here in Bratislava 4 years ago. So I'm very happy to be back. Yes, these big questions posed, and that's also one of the things that I find so inspiring about Central European Forum, that not being afraid to ask big questions. Can the absence of a legacy of citizen-inspired change be hampering the creation of a genuine civic space? And I guess I would say, as a historian, first of all, the short answer is well, yes, of course, but that I don't think that's a justification for fatalism. And of course, these different countries have very different experiences, but it's also the case that memory is highly selective. One can choose to look back to Jan Hus or Tadeusz Kościuszko or Masaryk or Jan Karski, or you can choose to look back to, Gustav Husak or Admiral Horthy or Tiso or Codriano. There are always multiple ambivalent legacies. I would also say, I always have to say this first as an American, because I fear that people idealize the West, and then I feel like the apologetic American. Well, let me come back to that. Poland, for instance, has a great tradition of fighting za waszo I naszą wolność. Poland had solidarity, which was unique in communist Eastern Europe, in that it was a truly mass movement. Charter 77 was extraordinarily impressive. It was not a mass movement. Solidarność was a mass movement. And Poland today is still struggling with nationalist populism. A few days ago, less than a week ago, there were far right-wing demonstrators on the streets that destroyed a rainbow monument and attacked the Russian embassy. It's not the case that if one has a certain legacy of something that seems impressive, that automatically means something will continue to be impressive. And let me make a banal empirical observation as a historian, which is that it's not the case that impressive historical moments are necessarily repeated. We can think of lots of examples of that. We can think about the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. We can think about Hungary in 1956. We can think about the Prague Spring of 1968, and the extraordinary movement that the Prague Spring of 1968 was. And then we can fast forward a few months and think about Jan Palach's self-immolation and the reaction, or the lack of some kind of a sufficient reaction to that. I'm thinking, of course, of that in particular this year because of Agnieszka Holland's film, Hořice Kerž, or Burning Bush. And one of the provocations of that film was precisely to talk about something that had gone unacknowledged. I mean, there was a sense that one of the lowest national moments could come so soon after one of the greatest national moments. That's also a story about radical contingency. We don't know what would have happened had there been no invasion in 1968. We don't know if Czechoslovakia would have shown the world a third way. We will never know if there would have been an authentic third way. What we do know is that revolution is difficult to sustain. It's exhausting. It's often demoralizing and disillusioning. And you see that not only, and here's my apologetic footnote as an American, you see that not only in Eastern and Central Europe, or in places that have less of perhaps a long democratic tradition, but you see plenty of it in the United States. And we do have a long democratic tradition. You see it even with the old 1968ers in the United States. If you think about what happened to the great activist of 1968, you know, Jerry Rubin sells out and becomes a trader on Wall Street, you know, and, you know, what happens to Bobby Seale and Huey Newton? I mean, Huey Newton, essentially one of the great founders of the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Movement, he ends up torturing and murdering his opponents, you know, including Bobby Seale. And Bobby Seale ends up apologizing for him. Abby Hoffman, my personal hero as a child, commits suicide. It's not the case that these traditions necessarily continue. I mean, the fate of old revolutionaries is often tragic. I would say also that despite the fact that I come from a country that does have a great legacy of citizen-inspired change, that does have a legacy, we had a civil rights movement, we had an anti-war movement not so long ago. We had a country of people who deeply believe in principle and a democratic tradition and in free elections. I would say 95% of Americans, I'm guessing now, believe that we would have had free elections. 2000 elections, you know, suddenly it's not clear who wins. Bush ends up, in my opinion, probably stealing the election. It was very close. Most people after that feel like they now live in a country in which the elections are not perfectly free, in which there is voter fraud. Do people run out to the streets in mass protest? Well, no. For the most part, no. That's a huge psychic shift in a country that always believed, we went from a country of people who believed we had free elections almost overnight to a country of people who believed that, no, probably we didn't have completely free elections, and by and large, people accepted it. You know, the capacity to normalize the abnormal, you know, and to accept things that would have previously seemed shocking is quite extraordinary. And that's true even when there is a tradition, a kind of radical shift in mentality. I'd say by 2004, we expected voter fraud. And then came Sarah Palin and the Tea Party. And Sarah Palin was right out of Europe in the 1930s. I think we were a hair's breadth away from fascism. She lived in a completely fictitious world in which anything was possible, and she had no sense of restraint. Let me move on then to another point. One of which is that the problem is not just whether or not there are historical precedents empowering the citizen and whether or not one can find in one's country historical precedents empowering the citizen. The problem is how people in the present choose to relate to those precedents. Let me talk just a little bit about the legacy of communism now, and the legacy of dissent against communism. In some ways, the legacy of dissent and the intellectual heritage of dissent against communism was our understanding of Havel's The Greengrocer. You know, Havel's Greengrocer, who was not so powerless after all. You know, the passivity that was essentially a kind of mauvaise foi, a kind of self-deception about one's own agency, and in that sense was immoral. Because the greengrocer, Havel said, was not so powerless, he was also responsible and therefore guilty because the line between victim and oppressor runs de facto through each person. That legacy of passivity was extremely important to understanding a dynamic, a post-1968 dynamic, perhaps especially in Czechoslovakia, but not only in Czechoslovakia. But I would like to say here, and I think this is a point Slavenka is also going to develop, that the legacy of communism with respect to civic initiative is not only passivity, and it's not only our understanding of the guilt of the greengrocer. There's a tendency, I think we might have in this discussion, to conflate passivity and illiberalism. And there is a relationship between those things, but they're not the same thing. And I think one question we might ask ourselves from the very beginning of this discussion is whether or not this is a discussion about the meaning of citizenship and civic action per se, or whether it's really, or whether we want it to be a discussion about liberalism. Because the legacy of Eastern Europe is also that 38% of the population in Czechoslovakia voted for the communists in genuinely free elections in 1946. that citizens took part in Stalinism, not just passively, but actively, that the February Revolution in Czechoslovakia happened with active participation, that things we don't like to think about, like the murder of Jews by their Polish neighbors in Jedwabne, that was not just about passivity, that was not just about following orders, that was about people acting. One of the things that I think the Soviet, post-communist Soviet historiography has brought us, in particular a kind of post-revisionist school that looked back on the Bolshevik Revolution, the experience of Stalinism, kind of through the lens of reading Hannah Arendt through Foucault, to simplify. But the central insight, I would say, of that school of historians who were a half generation before me, of people like Johann Helbeck and Igal Hafin and Stephen Kotkin, which was that subjectivity cannot just mean a liberal subjectivity. You know, we tend to assume that when we talk about agency and acting and subjectivity, that means people will act in a liberal direction, that they will act when they can act, when they embrace their subjectivity, when they understand they're empowered to act, then they will then act on behalf of liberal principles. And if we think about it empirically, we all know that that's not necessarily the case. The rise of Jobbik in Hungary is not necessarily about passivity. It can't necessarily be explained by passivity. It's also about people acting. The far-right demonstrators in Warsaw last week, they were not passive. You know, they weren't just following orders. They had an idea. They were acting. So active engagement, the idea that I am a citizen, it's my country, you know, or it's my public space, I should change something, is not necessarily acting on the nice side. It's not the case that when citizens act, they will act in a liberal manner. And we can't assume that to be a citizen means to act in a liberal democratic manner. And so it seems to me that in some ways the real question on the table this weekend is about responsibility. And, you know, of course, the idea that there's an absence of a certain kind of legacy, and that would then lead us to a kind of fatalistic assumption for the present. In a certain way, that's an abdication of responsibility. And I think there's a philosophical legacy in Eastern Europe that's very rich, and arguably richer than the equivalent philosophical legacy in the West, that's precisely about responsibility, about there being no escape from responsibility. That was the key question of the 1960s and revisionist Marxism, was how to reconcile historical determinism and individual responsibility. Now, there was no solution found for it, but I think arguably it was precisely philosophers in this part of Europe who pushed that question further and grappled with it more intensely than anywhere else. You know, Jan Patočka said that the thing about responsibility is that we carry it with us everywhere. He says that, you know, we have to think of responsibility not as a relationship to some kind of object, but as an ontological trait of the kind of beings that we are, something about our being itself. In one of his, arguably, oh, yes, okay, sorry, I'm speaking too quickly for the poor interpreter, so I will try to speak more. No, a very reasonable request. I will try to speak more slowly. I wanted to just mention Jan Patočka in the 1970s, at the instigation of at that time, a young Polish graduate student named Krzysztof Michalski, who pushed him to write essays about his philosophy of history. Those essays that were originally given as underground lectures in private apartments and circulated in Samizdat. One of them, Krzysztof managed to translate into Polish and publish in the Polish journal Znak before the space for that kind of publishing collapsed in Poland as well. But that essay that he managed to publish, that Patočka conceived and wrote in the 1970s, was called Does History Have a Meaning? And Patočka there makes the argument that history as such begins when meaning is shaken, when our naive certainty about the meaning of history is shaken, when we are in some sense therefore shattered and we have to search for that meaning ourselves. And for Petočka, the thing itself was the search. It was the acceptance of responsibility that we are co-creators of the meaning in this world, and we must seek out and create that meaning ourselves. And I would say that East Central Europe in particular, I'm thinking of Petočka, I'm thinking of Karol Kosek, of Bohumil Janat, of Ladislav Hejdanek, of Kołakowski, of Ingarden, of the praxis philosophers. These were people who were all obsessively concerned with the problem of responsibility. One of the key ways I think that Ingarden, the Polish philosopher Roman Ingarden, at a certain point moves further away from his Doktorvater and his mentor Edmund Husserl, was this idea that he articulates in 1968 that you need a very rich, full idea of the human subject that can't just be the kind of brainy but bodiless, ego of Descartes, to hold responsibility across time. You need a constancy of the I. You need a human subject that is fleshy enough to carry itself with some consistency from one time and place for another in order to talk about responsibility. I would also say this is one of the key ways in which a philosophical legacy of East Central Europe departs from the French turn to that same, in some sense, that same Central European phenomenological tradition. There's a distinct rejection, I think, of a certain kind of postmodernism that is seen by some philosophers here, and perhaps correctly, as creating a notion of a subjectivity that is too unstable, that is too variable, that is too flickering, that is too mobile, that is too in flux, and therefore does not insist on a constancy of the I across time that can carry that responsibility. I think from the point of view of people like Leszek Kołakowski, people like the Belgian literary critic Paul de Man or Hans Robert Gauss, who at the end of their lives or after their lives it comes out that they were in some ways implicated in Nazism. The idea that the I who is speaking now, and the self who is remembered are not at all the same person was slightly too convenient. While it might be philosophically seductive and while there might be truth in it, there was something slightly too convenient about it. Let me maybe move on to one more point I want to make, and that has to do with the memory problem. I think one of the things I've seen as an outsider, as an observer coming to this part of the world for 20 years now, is that accounting with the past after communism has often been about accounting with the problem of collaboration, which assumes in some ways a kind of passivity, a submission to power, and a forgetting that what was bad was not necessarily submissive, but also active. I also would like to argue that the memory problem is perhaps less the problem that there is not enough of a democratic tradition to remember, and perhaps more a problem of not always posing the right questions, of memory co-opted by a certain felt moral imperative to account with the past. And for me, I've written about it, watching from a distance the Milan Kundera affair, for instance, was very interesting because I felt like it was a moment at which the opportunity was lost to ask what should have been the important questions. I'm not saying that the question of whether or not Milan Kundera, as a student, actually did report this spy in his dormitory or not, but I think that's of secondary importance to what might have been a pretext for asking the crucial historical questions. For instance, Czechoslovakia, which was the only one of the successor states to the empires created at Versailles to some extent, the only one that maintained some kind of a functioning democracy all the way through the interwar years, all the way through Munich, then goes on to have the bloodiest experience of Stalinism. Now, why is that? For me, Kundera was a moment. Why were so many of the best and brightest minds of Kundera's generation drawn to Stalinism? Why do the communists win 38% of the votes in genuinely free elections? That cannot be explained by some kind of cheap opportunism. There was a case in Poland about an informer who was very active in dissent, Leszek Maleszka, that comes out around 1999-2000. Which is a fascinating case because it was someone who as a young student was arrested, who was threatened, who then becomes a secret police collaborator and goes on to inform on his friends for years and years and years. And then when it comes out of the archives, 10 years after the collapse of communism, and he's interviewed by some excellent documentary filmmakers saying, how could you betray your friends? How could you continue to collaborate with the secret police even after they murder your best friend? How could you? And he kept answering, doskonałe pytanie, doskonałe pytanie. It was an excellent question. He was unable to answer the question himself. And it was a fascinating moment of looking at once a self is split, once you live a double life like that so long, does any kind of authentic self remain? What do we learn about subjectivity from looking at cases like Leszek Maleszka's case? What do we learn about totalitarianism and intimacy by looking at the Jedwabny case? What does it mean that neighbors killed neighbors? What does it mean that people were burned to death by people whom they addressed by the diminutives of their names because they were so close to them? What does that tell us? So I think I think part of the problem, I think in some ways the deeper problem is less the absence of a democratic tradition, in some cases like the failure to ask the more critical questions about the past. I would make a very brief note, and I think the rise of the kinds of right-wing nationalism that many of us feel uneasy about, or many of us feel is connected to an absence of a democratic tradition, I think is always in some ways connected to an insufficient ability to confront that past, to ask the real questions, a failure to face the real sources of evil, a somewhat cheap but understandable attempt at purification by exporting evil and placing it somewhere else, somewhere outside, a failure to take responsibility, a longing for a lack of moral ambiguity, which unfortunately the human condition is one of often of extreme moral ambiguity. It's an understandable longing for the absence of moral ambiguity, but it is always in some ways like the law in Poland and the Institute of National Remembrance that made it a crime to impute to the Polish nation complicity in the crimes of Nazism or Stalinism. You know, this is just immaturity. This is a failure to take responsibility, as my friend, the historian Dariusz Stola said. Well, now we know everything bad that happened in Poland was done by Martians. Let me end just making a very brief reference to a story that was recently published by an American Jewish fiction writer, Nathan Englander, called What We Really Talk About When We Talk About Anne Frank. And I think this is a story that is significant. It's a fiction. It's a work of fiction. I think it has significance not only for Jews, for American Jews, for Jews in general, and how we remember the Holocaust. I think the lesson is important all over this region for people who have been through traumatic experiences. It's a story about two couples. Two Jewish couples who have not seen each other for a long time, and now when they're in their 40s and they have children who are maybe becoming teenagers, they meet in New York after not having seen each other for a long time. And as the conversation goes on, it's revealed that the two women who were the original friends, the two wives, they used to play this game together when they were young Jewish girls growing up in New York. And the game was that you imagined one of your friends or one of your classmates or somebody you knew was living during the Holocaust. And you ask yourself, would that person rescue me? Would that person hide me? And that's a game that they haven't played since they were children, but now as adults, after they've been drinking and reminiscing, they start to play it again. And as we move towards the end of the story, they play this game with one another. And at the very end of the story, each couple plays it with each other. The husbands and the wives play it together. So the wife has to ask herself, you know, if this man in front of me, who now is my husband, if he were a non-Jew living during the Holocaust, would he save me? And the story ends with the moment at which all four of them in the room understand that one of the women doesn't believe her husband would save her. And that is what can never be spoken and what they will never say, but that lingers in the room as a source of silent terror. And it's so significant, I think, for how Jews talk about the Holocaust, because it's a moment of understanding that what we are terrified of from that legacy is in some ways not only outside, but it is inside ourselves. And therefore, we can never truly escape from it.
Thank you very much. Well, it was supposed to be a short lecture, and it was a short lecture. One word about that. I believe democracy is like a religion. It's very similar. We believe in that. We believe in democracy, or we don't. Most of us do. What it means is probably that one can or should even separate from believers from churchgoers. Where in a country like Poland, for example, we have much more churchgoers than believers. As far as democracy is concerned, we have much more believers than churchgoers. I mean, the vast majority of society believes in democracy. I mean, with some reservations, of course. But if you say, what would you do? Or if you ask, what you did for democracy in your country? Not giving life or something, or blood or something like that. These simple things. The answer is not so encouraging, I would say. So it's very easy to say in countries like Eastern Europe that these are democratic countries, but we lack democrats. But that's not the truth. We have no custom to practice democracy. This is the difference. The problem is how to encourage people to practice. This is something you can do. And this is very difficult because people are first too shy. They say, well, what can I help? I'm not an important person. What can I do? I'm not good enough to take this post. I don't even dream to be a representative or a school board member or whatever. That's also the legacy, not of communist time, but of very long-lasting Middle Ages here in this part of the Europe. I mean, this peasant society, boys societies, classical peasant society, local people, shy people, staying at home, don't go out. Very different experience for centuries. That's my remark concerning this deep lecture, because we have this problem with goers, not believers, I believe. The next is Slovenka Drakulec. What's your message from Croatia?
Message? I have no message. Today I read something very funny. which I thought was fantastic. In Croatian news, they reported that the new Pope, because we have this phenomenon of Medjugorje, where allegedly Jesus' mother spoke to 4 children. It's like Lourdes, and tens of millions of people have visited that place already, but Vatican didn't recognize it. And this is about the message. The new Pope said, well, you know, she is not working in a post office to send messages. This is how he dismissed the idea that Maria would address these children. I thought it was absolutely brilliant way to. So no messages from Croatia, but I think already so many important questions were posed, and so such a encompassing analysis was already done by Marcy, that I will focus on just a couple of points, very few points about post-communism in my own country. And I was born in Yugoslavia, lived for 40 years there, and the rest I'm living in Croatia. So I do have some experience of life under communism, because my bigger part of my life happened there. So I will focus on my region, so to say, because this is nowadays called region. It's not called Yugoslavia. We can't say either former Yugoslavia. It's a more elegant way to say the region. So I would like to just give you a couple of observations, or my own, of course. Of course, that yes and yes again to the question that the panel posed. Is the absence, or could the absence of legacy of citizen-inspired change be hampering the creation of genuine civic space? This is, of course, the case in my former and my now country, of course. But I recognize a couple of factors there which I think are important, and this is what I would like to share with you tonight. And this is, of course, when we say civic sphere, we of course know what we mean, that this is participation of citizens in institutional but also non-institutional activities, alternative activities, and also non-political activities. So after 1989, I think throughout Eastern Europe, you could, and some people called it so, you could recognize that democracy started as what they call empty form, as an empty form. So there are institutions, as you already said, but there is no democracy. And what is then replacing democracy? Because democracy, obviously, apart from institutions, has to be built. So we are building it. But in the meantime, what is happening? If you have empty forms, you have elections, you have parliament, you have a multi-party system, you have everything you want. But modus operandi, the mentality of people there is still very traditional. And it basically means, in my region, Balkans and a little bit wider, it's tribal. These are people who are doing it, doing favors to each other through the tribal system of friends and family first, then come friends, and so on. So it's a kind of horizontal network, which is incredibly strong. It is incredibly strong, and 20 years after having independent state and having democracy, it is still pretty much an empty form in that sense. So it's party membership, it's family, friends, party membership, or maybe the other way around, party membership first. And of course, it differs from country to country, but I think this tribal attitude, tribal mentality, is still very, very strong. And it is, not to forget, I wouldn't like to forget, it's not a question, it's just a statement, that this is the source of corruption. This is the roots of corruption. Because by being a member in the party or by being the family, you are in position. You come into position to become corrupt. This is one point. The other point in terms of heritage in preventing civil society is that all structures, especially in Yugoslavia, all structures of control, and this is the secret police in the first place, were never really abolished. never confronted in the sense that Marcy spoke about confronting the past, confronting, if you want, evil, confronting and taking responsibility. Nothing of that kind of work was done there. So, no lustrazia in no form. Maybe, I don't know, maybe Slovaks would say something about that because it's a very small country. And so if you lustrate people, who will remain? Nobody will have clean hands. That's one of the problems of the small country, no? No trials, nothing of the sort. Not even documents. Recently it was discovered, and it took a Dutch historian to come and discover, because he wanted to write a book. And he discovered that most of the documents from the communist times were stolen. From the Tudjman times also were stolen or hidden away. So in the state archives, practically you have nothing. And if you want to look into this, what is remaining there, the police has to approve it. You can't walk in and, as a historian, take the document. So it's still pretty much closed chapter. We have a recent development with so-called Lex Perkovic. This is a very interesting development of the story because there is the whole entire hullabaloo this summer and confrontation of Croatia with European Commission because of that. Namely, a day before entering, this is just so to say sidebar because we can't go into that. Before entering European Communion on the first European Union on the Communion, mind you, on the 1st of July, Croatian Parliament signed a law whereby they are not going to deliver not culprits but suspects, so to say, abroad. And this was all done. And then 2 months of fight with the European Commission, they, so to say, changed back because they have to say, Croatia has to make the law according to the European Union. There is no law. There is no way not to do it. But it's all done because there is a certain gentleman called Perkovic who was a secret policeman during Tito and also secret policeman during Tudjman. He just continued, you know. And they do not want to extradite him, and he is responsible for a crime committed in Germany, and it is Germans who want him. They want him, and they want to make a process against him. So Germans didn't give up, of course. But Croatia will now change constitution in order not to deliver this gentleman. So strong is this protection and this horizontal system of protection of the past. And then, of course, we normally come to the third point, which I think is very important in hampering the civil society, and this is the very idea of history, which, of course, decides the future, and this is division that exists always in every communist country, and this is between official history and private memory. This is such a strong and painful division. Always under communism, what we learned in school, it was always official version of history. And at home, at the table, you would hear different kind of stories, as I'm sure it happened in Slovakia or in Hungary or in Czech Republic or in Poland, anywhere. So this gap between history and memory, it takes a lot to overcome it. In Croatia, or I could say with my full responsibility in Yugoslavia, nothing of that ever happened. You know that Croatia, like Slovakia, was a fascist state during the war and so on. Nothing ever came. So it's more complicated because we have war after war. We have Second World War, which was not articulated, was never nothing done about it, never, ever, nothing, never anything, okay? Never anything done about that war. And then the second war, Balkan Wars, came after, based and connected very much with that Second World War, and yet 20 years afterwards, we do not confront that past. So the gap is there. And I think it makes everything very difficult because you have to build civic space On what? On what facts? What are the facts? We have no facts. That's and the first, but and the fourth moment, which I think is very important, is the war itself. The war in Croatia, that is the wars, they are plural, in the Balkans, in Bosnia, in Croatia, in Kosovo. And when war happens, it doesn't happen overnight. It has to be built up. People have to be prepared for it. But when it happens, when it's in the preparation, there is a need for homogeneity, a very strong need. If you do not homogenize, at that point, you are a traitor, plain and simple. You have to leave or you will be dealt with, as many people were. So this homogeneity, of course, normally prevents any kind of anti-governmental or any kind of anti or civic or anything activity. It prevents it and basta. After the war, interestingly enough, the government continued to operate in the very same way as before the war. And that is, we are at the moment of empty democracy. Democracy is a form, and authoritarian, very authoritarian government of the first president, Mr. Tudjman. So in this vein, we continue. There is one small thing that I would like to mention here, because we have no time to discuss this, and this is that I think at this point in time it's very difficult to discuss civic activities without speaking about media, without taking into account press. We all would like to believe, and believed before, that in democracy press will be free, but it's not free. And civic or public space cannot be created and does not exist, in my opinion, without free media. We take it for granted that in democracy media is free, but this is a completely different issue. Media is not free. We have to fight for this freedom every single day, and we are losing. I'm saying that because I'm working all my life in the media. Now, after telling you all that, how difficult it was to establish any kind of life on the level of these groups and associations, I could say that in the last 20 years after the war, we do witness a lot of activities. In all these countries, there is a lot of non-institutional, of course, organizations, free associations. They are saving they are saving the city, they are saving in Zagreb. There is a pretty big and strong organization of people who are trying to, working against devastation of the city, because we have a mayor now in his third term who I think he swore to his mother, or I don't know to whom, to destroy the city, and he's doing it very successfully. But so we have that kind of organization. We have workers who have lost their job, who come in the streets. We have gay and lesbian organizations. We have also people who are trying to save trees, not successfully, but they are trying to save them. The symbol of all this became a gay parade, which is held every year, and it's after a while it became a symbol, and a successful symbol. There are thousands of people who are marching, participating, and so you could say this is state of human rights in Croatia is symbolized in that way. I do not need perhaps to tell you that the influence of such organizations is tiny, it's symbolic, it's small, and but it's there. Thousand flowers, as Mao would say. But what I would now, to pose the question and to give you an example of what actually could happen when genuine civic space is created on the big scale, on a really big scale. It is a year about now that an organization called, a civic organization, a proper, genuine civic organization called All for Family. Now, when I hear all for I don't know, for homeland, or all for something, I really got my goosebumps, because I don't like this word all. No, I don't want to give my life for family, or for state, or for any such foolishness. But this is called All for Family. And they are backed by silently backed by the Conservative Party, and they are very silently backed and helped by the Catholic Church. So they organized All for Family. They collected. Now, first let me tell you that Croatia has about 4,300,000 people, inhabitants. They managed to collect 730,000 signatures in order to force the government to call for a referendum. Now, it's a very big number of people, and you might ask yourself, for what? What kind of referendum do they want? What kind of very important, vital question they want to solve in this way? What is the big problem? Is it economic? Is it political? What is it? Is it social? No. They want referendum in order to change the constitution and one particular article that speaks about marriage. They want to insert into constitution that the marriage is a unity of a man and a woman. They want to define it in gender terms. And this is why they put 730,000 signatures in the country that has, I don't know, 99% of GDP is going for solving serving the debt, and we have, I don't know, minus. Sorry? Oh, you can ask later, or you can talk later, but just let me finish. So, in a country that is that's not really in a good economic situation, and there are many problems there. So, this is what is happening there now. I think what are we facing here, and that already both of you have mentioned that problem is I think we should ask ourselves, do we have perhaps a prejudice that every or a romantic view of civic activities and civic organization, are they all working for better of all of us? Are they all, who is deciding what is better? Who is deciding what is a public interest? I don't think that this action is in public interest. I think it's, in terms of civilization, a step backwards, as it is always possible, and we have seen it. So, genuine civic initiative can produce something totally opposite of what I think we believe in. And therefore, we first should ask ourselves about prejudices that we have about, because I believe it's a prejudice to think that everything that citizens organize and do outside of institutions is fantastic, and it's going to save the city, the park, or civilization. And it's progressive, it's liberal, and so on. The values could differ very much. And the other question is, which is the question that was raised in Croatia, and it was a lot of people who addressed the parliament in that sense. And this is, should human and minority rights be a subject of a change in the constitution? That's a very important question, and it's very dangerous. Because today, of course, today it will be gays' marriages. Tomorrow it will be women's rights to vote. The day after will be gypsies out of anything, I don't know, of schools. So it's a very, I mean, if you let constitution be changed and infringing on minority and human, especially human rights, I think you are in dire straits. Therefore, we have to ask ourselves about this issue of liberal, good-thinking, progressive, or we have to define interests and we have to define responsibility of such groups. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This, of course, seems to be the crucial problem. Is democracy able to be inclusive? Or another way, does it not have to be excluding
when there is not a real or genuine civic space and civic culture. I mean, what you said is happens in a very similar way in Poland. We also have very active, excluding conservative majority, ready to, oh, I mean, not so impressive number, but they gathered 1 million signs in 36 million society. So this is bigger number, but not that important. Requesting a referendum concerning whether 6 years old children should go to school or not. This is also bring children back to families and so on and so on. This way of political argument. Well, this shows the tension or the risk. What can happen with democracy when there is not the civil society, the civic tradition, when the majority is passive and radicals, only radicals are active, like in Warsaw last Monday. There were only 6,000 people, but nobody else on the street. I mean, those are only people who are on the street politically in Poland and in many other countries are radicals. This creates new situation for democracy and especially in this region. Well, I would turn now to Peter Esterhazy with the question. Well, jobbing has been mentioned here already, but this is as a symbol of civic activity. Not everybody would like. Well, where does it come from that in your opinion, that in so many countries, if civic activity is signable, if it's important, then it turns to the right? Might I take this mic, please?
Olyan ez a kérdés, mint hogyha az iskolában ülné.
It is a question. I might get at school and you would glimpse at my notes and you would ask me to clarify what I have written there. Because the issue is as follows. Slavenka said that she doesn't like slogans, all for family, etc. I always get problems when I hear similar slogans, because at school we had hyperactive members of student organizations and who incited us all the time to be more active. I studied mathematics at university. Mathematics is not about ideology. A plus B equals C, and it was free of ideological components, and this is why I didn't do anything more. I studied, I played soccer, and I read, but student activists did not find this sufficient. They said I should be more active. Our activity at the time consisted in visiting Roma settlements. We brought them apples. Roma were very happy about the apples, and our role was to teach Roma children mathematics. There were children of 12 or girls, Roma girls of 12 or 13 years. They were beautiful girls. I talked to them, they listened to me, they ate apples, and I went back home. So this was my activism in the 1980s. So with this I want to say that activity is a dubious thing. And my question is whether the civil life should be limited to being active. Here I would like to come back to three basic notions. That's citizen, or responsibility and provincialism or parochialism. That's another important point. What is a citizen? I can ask a question referring to what Masaryk had said, whether there is at all a citizen as such, as a phenomenon. Speaking about Hungary, I believe that it exists, he exists, but in each period we only have one citizen. In 1920s or 1930s, Sándor Márai was the only such citizen. Today we have such a citizen, Peter Nadaš. It means that there is an absence of citizens, and the citizens should have the ability of being true to themselves, to be authentic. Why is it so? I believe that dictatorship or ideology of dictatorship, as you said, was not as important. What was really decisive was that dictatorship eliminated, destroyed many traditions. For example, it destroyed the tradition of classical social democracy, and it also destroyed burghers' traditions. So what came out of it was a kind of a mix, and also citizens turned out to be a mix of all these things, and the result was a provincial person, which was also the result of Kadar's dictatorship. And this small town mentality made people more vulnerable to the wishes of the powerful. In this connection, I also could speak about parochialism. I believe that parochialism is the key issue of our region and space. I want to support what the Slavenka said, that parochialism creates homogeneity. Homogeneity does not mean absence of equality, but it means fear of what's outside. Therefore, we are closed in our parochialism, but this may also apply to big nations, not only to small nations. And this is connected with the nation state. We can find this also in France. Madame Le Pen can be successful in France because she offers the French the freedom not to consider what's outside of our close circle. We should look only to our own things that matter to us, but this is not possible because nothing can exist in isolation in this world. It cannot exist in this small country and in my own small country, which is also trying to ward off the outside world. And regarding dictatorship, one of the consequences of dictatorship was that a person living under dictatorship had a feeling that he cannot change anything, that he does not have any responsibility for anything because everything is decided by the dictatorship. So this person behaves like a child. We don't have to go back to dictatorships prior to 1945, but socialization had the result of people's belief that the state is going to take care of their problems. The Hungarian society at Kadar's times realized they lived under dictatorship, but there were always some possibilities of finding a way of how to fool this dictatorship, how to um, uh, live under such a system. It has nothing to do with responsibility, and as a result, people became egoistic, selfish, and this mentality was continued also in the 1990s. We did not learn that what can be done and what will be done is something that we all have to do ourselves. If we want to clean our our yard, we have to sweep it ourselves. Nobody else will do it for us. So, uh, but what exists in our country is a person who is full of contradictions because people expect the state to resolve, to deal with their problems. And the current authoritarian trends are nurtured by this mentality. Therefore, the current Hungarian government can afford to say that I'll take care of your problems. Europe is not what it says it is. I'll go to Brussels and I'll destroy all the enemies, and then I'll come back and have a look at our bank accounts to see whether Brussels sent us the money that's been allocated to us.
So one could think that a person grown up on European rationalism would think that this behavior should result in a scandal, but that's not the case. And we have this experience from our nearest past, socialization, which means that these societies can do or will do what the power wants them to do. And it's not only an Eastern European phenomenon. Populism is popular not only in this region, but it's also in France or in the Netherlands. So we see that parochialism marches across Europe. So we see a movement towards European integration. I don't know what kind of movement, but such a movement exists. And it comes into a conflict with the tendency of ever stronger feelings for a national state.
Well, the still promising state, of course, is a problem. Because if you believe, you don't feel that you need to be active. You don't need to. You don't feel that you need to organize. If you look at civic societies, they usually like. This is very, very clear in Polish experience. They usually appear when something is very painful. I mean, people, at least in Poland, start to do something in public sphere, start to be ready for civic activities when the situation is extremely painful, when there is no sausage, for example, in the country. And people protest, people organize. And they fight for sausage, and they get the sausage, and they come back home. This is the problem. well, I think especially with these postmodern politicians who are in power in most of the Europe, that they, if you ask, they give the sausage, and people go back home. There's no reason to create permanent structures. No customs are established because it happened with ACTA treaty, for example, when a young generation has been attacked by the establishment with the risk that they will have to pay for anything they will take from the internet, and they protested, and establishment withdraw. And ACTA treaty has been postponed. So they went back home. The business has been done. The new solution has been achieved. No reason to organize, to be active anymore. Well, in my opinion, we East Europeans have this kind of experience for a long time. Even if you look at Hungary or the Czechoslovakia experience of 56 and 68, people protested. The protest has been very cruel, in a very cruel way, pieced. And what happened then? Then the new government started to pay, yes, to give some more money, more food, more goods, and so on, just to make people engaged in their private life, not engaged in politics. Go home, you will get sausage. If you stay home, you have sausage. If you are on the street, you don't have sausage. This is tens or perhaps even more years of this kind of public policy, and we just learned that this is the proper.
Csak egy fél mondatot akarnék közbeszólni.
Pravna. Here we can even say, and you could sum it up like this, there was no freedom, but there were small islands of freedom, private islands of freedom. For instance, take the period of Kadar. Politics came with an invention after 56. We had this very strict Kadar regime, and they have said the ones who are not with us are against us. And then they modified this and said the ones who are not against us are immediately with us. And I want to say that both statements you find even in Bible, so it's quotations from Bible.
Well, I would ask you about the Slovakia, of course. How you see that? Because my presumption is that if Slovak organizers ask this kind of question, it means you see the problem here as well. Is it?
I feel in a situation which 20 years ago I experienced already in Prague during a similar discussion, and Michnik, Konrad, Pithart, and me were sitting there, and there was a young student who attacked Peter Pithart with a question: what did you do to save united Czechoslovakia? And Peter Pithart, scared to death, said, I'm just writing a study about this. And I have written several essays, books about Slovakia, and I tried to understand the Slovak soul, so to say, which is in a way a split soul. And I claim for a few years now that we have two Slovakias, but I think it's not a great discovery, because I'm sure that there are also two Polands and two Hungaries and two Croatias. One Slovakia, the smaller Slovakia, is the open Slovakia, which also in '89 wanted mostly freedom and democracy, and the second Slovakia is a closed one, encapsulated one, which is looking inwards and doesn't desire so much to have individual freedom, because it is not even desiring to have responsibility. And that is the answer to the question which we heard at the beginning, and that is the majority of society wants to have certainties, not freedoms, and that is the situation of Slovakia today. I was saying this already before the word certainty. Certainties became a part of the slogans of the political party in power today. It's very simple to offer certainties, and that is something you can attract people to join. But if you tell someone, take responsibility, be responsible for yourself, be responsible for a group, that's a problem, because then you must start thinking about yourself. So the majority, even in '89, which we are going to remember, especially by forgetting, as we usually do. So even then, majority of society was not desiring freedom. They wanted more consumption, maybe a better world than a bit better what they had before '89. And even before '89, it was so that the regime didn't want people to think. They wanted people to consume, but not to think, for God's sake. So, and people would mostly miss traveling. A greater part of society missed freedom of belief, of religion, and maybe even if people were given this freedom of religion, if people were allowed to travel and to go to church, the regime could go on. So it's very little what they wanted. So the real freedom, democracy, is something that only a smaller part of society missed. That part of society which was the carrier of the open society, so to say. And so we see these two Slovakias still. But as I say, I think the same you can see in all neighboring countries which face several similar problems. And there was a time when I thought that the Czech Republic has already managed to overcome these problems, and that they have a civil society which has achieved it. But I think that this year we observed and we saw that there is a myth, that there is only a myth of Czech civil society. It's nothing more than a myth. So I think we shouldn't envy each other. Slavenka mentioned a situation which was very similar to our situation in the 90s, even though you didn't see it from the outside. We had an authoritarian, non-democratic government under Mečiar, and you had a similar situation under Tudjman. So it was similar situation, not identical, of course. We had a softer version, I would say. But after '89, we were unable to unite society. And I am a living memory. I lived my first 50 years with several totalitarian regimes. And I always see, be it the 39, 45, 48, 68, 89, 93. So there was always a rupture, and this break was based always on exclusion, but not on inclusion. We excluded for racial reason, religious reasons, whatever reason. So communists would exclude for 40 years continuously because you excluded from the party, you had different models of exclusion. So till basically you could say that the exclusion continued so long that there was nobody else left, because only the last person, Secretary General, stayed. Everyone else was excluded. So we could say that in Czechoslovakia it was a free fall of communism, and therefore it is maybe so that we were not able to make a Auseinandersetzung with our communist past. It's a sad, more sad part of our history. It is maybe a fact for a larger area, not only for Slovakia, but the truth is that we are not willing to have a debate, a discourse on the issues, and then you can see what you see happening. Like yesterday, we have also an institute of the memory of the nation, which should be an institution responsible for the moral status in society. So then this Institute of the Memory of a Nation wanted to give a award to a historian, so to say historian, who is actively involved in the adoration of fascist Slovakia. So this is another proof that we were not able to start, not even to pass this way of facing our past. I'm not saying that we should punish, but maybe we even don't have to pardon, but what we should do at least is to remember. And we see that tonight, before the 17th of November, we could say that this year is a year of forgetting in Slovakia. It's sad, but I've never been an optimist.
Well, forgetting is not easy, and forecasting is even more difficult, usually. But, well, I would like to turn to the future a bit. Because the question given concerns the future and the problem whether we are able to overcome all these obstacles or not, and how, seems to be crucial for the future of the entire East and Central Europe. We see in majority of countries, at least, we see that if genius civic space is being created, it's created by those who don't like democracy too much, don't like civic space too much, and it's mostly occupied by them, not by those who believe in democracy, because they are not churchgoers. Believers are not churchgoers, and churchgoers are those who don't believe. This is the paradox of, I think, of democratic transition in this part of the world, but perhaps not only in this one, because if you see what's going on on the other side of Mediterranean Sea, it's very similar in countries like Tunisia, for example, where extremely well organized are those who are not very much fond of democratic solutions, and those who support them are losing ground. So, well, I would like also to invite all of you to join the debate. If you would like to add something or ask questions in short interventions, if somebody would like, please raise your hand, and we'll try to deliver the voice to you. Well, do you see the way back to our democratic hopes and hopes for civic society that were so strong in 1989, Well, perhaps I would start with Mercy again, and how could we, in your opinion, reach this change? Mercy.
I should say, first of all, as a historian, I'm always very wary about making predictions or
Well,
recommendations for the future.
Projects.
I think one of the myths of 1989, perhaps, was a notion of freedom and democracy as something that was going to necessarily be happy and pleasant. I think part of what, and I say this partially as a historian of this part of Europe, but also as a citizen of a very different country with a very different history, yet one in which I see struggling with, again, some of the same problems. And let me just remind anybody who might be, tempted again to idealize the West that the United States sent to Europe to fight the Nazis racially segregated military troops. There were miscegenation laws in the United States until 1967, making it illegal for marriage or sexual intercourse between people of different races. So not in my lifetime, but in the lifetime of my parents, and this is not slavery 200 years ago. We interned Japanese Americans during the war. But I think Americans too often suffer from, in different ways, from this idea that what is good and democratic is somehow going to be nice and pleasant. I mean, this was in some ways the problem of liberalism, what Freud understood. You look inside yourself and it's not necessarily going to be nice. I think taking that kind of responsibility to forge a civic space means asking questions that have upsetting answers. Sartre understood this. The whole French existentialist notion of freedom was that freedom is responsibility, is anguish. Leszek Kolakowski wrote an essay, decades ago called "Ethics Without a Moral Code," in which he says that there is no code, be it Catholic or communist or democratic, that can tell us a priori how we should act. Because the truth is that life will constantly throw at us situations in which legitimately good values are in conflict, and we will be forced to choose. There is no easy way to choose. To accept responsibility and to act morally is to live in anguish. And I think part of creating that kind of responsible civic space will involve overcoming the myth of freedom and democracy as something that is necessarily nice and pleasant and happy. And grappling with the fact that what we are afraid of, and what haunts us from the past, and what we would like to exclude is also in some ways part of us and inside of us. And therefore the choices we make about how we will work through them will necessarily be difficult choices. I think it also is the case, and I say this as someone who in some ways was a young student of the generation older than me of the States, of the activist of the 1960s and 1970s, is that kind of engagement that means going out on the streets and staying there even when you get the sausage. That kind of engagement, that kind of refusing to accept the state as the savior, and saying that I'm going to keep pushing even when we might momentarily get what we want, is exhausting. It's exhausting, and very few people are able to stick it out. It wore down, the best of the revolutionaries. That kind of stamina you need to kind of go out there every day and keep pushing is almost psychically impossible to sustain. So it's difficult, it's painful, and it's exhausting. And I think creating then that kind of tradition and saying we want something involves facing with eyes wide open, just how difficult and painful it can be.
Well, but the problem is not to make people stay on streets forever. Well, one should be able to come back home, sometimes at least. But to keep them engaged on a very low level, to read newspaper once a week, to feel you should be more or less informed, to know what you vote for, more or less. Not very, very high level. The problem of Eastern Europe is, in my opinion, that on the very low level of everyday activity, there is a vacuum. And this kind of civic activity, lack of this kind of civic activity makes democracy very, very difficult and non-effective and fragile in front of populism. Because then populists come and they say whatever, and you believe if you know nothing. Well, so this kind of engagement seems to be a problem in Poland, at least the major problem. Do you have any good do you have any solution or good experience to share?
I have no message and I have no solution, of course. And it's also not my task as a journalist and writer to give solutions. Then I would be, maybe in politics. They are very good in solutions. But Peter mentioned something which I think, addressed something which I think is very important, and this is parochialism, homogenization, nationalism, exclusion. Regarding future, I also, of course, am not into predicting business, but I read it as signs on the wall, as Americans would say, and I read it as signs of insecurity and fear. And as we heard tonight, majority of society wants to have certainty, not freedom. So you have obvious signs of fear and insecurity. Now the question is, also already mentioned, who is going to read these signs? Who is going to address the fear? Because we could say, okay, these people are afraid, but the fear is real. You can analyze the reasons. I don't have time to go into reasons, but the fear, the feeling of insecurity. Is it because too many immigrants are coming in Italy? Or is it because there is no money enough? Or is it because of this? Or is it insecurity and fear? And of course, distrust of political sphere, complete distrust. Yeah? So all of that leads and in the leading parties, there is no vacuum in politics. In politics, it works like that. If the big party does not address this fear, there will be something out there. There will be, we can call them populists, we can call them Le Pen or whatever, but there will be somebody who will read this fear, who will manipulate the fear and turn it into their own use. And what does it mean? When you look at the global picture, 20 years ago in Europe, more than 20 years ago, it was only Jörg Haider in Austria. And he was completely isolated very quickly. Now you have more than 20 countries where right-wing parties are either participating in the parliament, being voted into parliament, or being very, very influential and strong. The right is on the rise. And I think this is very much connected. This is a reaction to this fear. So I will not make any conclusions out of it, but I would say that I, as a citizen, am also afraid. I'm afraid of fear.
Well, it's not enough to be afraid. Yes.
I'm doing my best to do something as a person, but I do not see that we are developing some kind of antidote, that we are developing some kind of mechanisms which are not populist, which are not right-wing or anything of that.
But you know, we have to. We have to do it. You have to develop another understanding, institutions, whatever, to save the democracy, because otherwise the fear, if it's really the growing factor of our reality, and seems to be, to me at least, then we may lose democracy one way or another. So, well, I'm impressed that there are many politologists. Of course, there's John Keane, for example, who just published a book about new democracy after the decadence of media. How can it work? That's not only East European problem.
I said we didn't talk about media at all, and we can't develop that line of discussion now because it would take us too much. But you will notice that nobody of us mentioned another thing that goes very well hand in hand with democracy, and that's capitalism. Consumerism, capitalism, it was not mentioned at all. So this discussion is a little bit, in that sense, isolated, because we have to, if we would really want to, analyze the causes and so on, we would have to bring all these elements in, and this would be very complex analysis.
Peter?
I can, not now.
Hogy kicsit eltávolítsam ettől az engem.
If to speak about activity and the challenges activity poses, then the second part of this question is, yes, you should be active, but where? So what is this power creating communities, societies? That's very doubtful. Is it a nation? But what makes people a nation? And the populists have a clear answer which functions, but what is the real answer? What do I have in mind? I have in mind our children. Our children, 2-3 generations younger than us, and many of them say, this is not my story, I am not interested in it, it's your problem, you solve it. And I say in vain, okay, we didn't solve it, so it means we were unable to solve it, you have to solve it, because if you will be unable to solve it, you will live in a muddy, murky future. I try to be a member of micro society, micro community, and you may very easily ask a question, say that the Turks in Germany who are immigrants, aliens who come, it is not the same as when people, Europeans, came to America looking for a new homeland. It's a different situation. They came to Germany because there was better life, better working conditions. They send money back to Turkey, and one day they go back to Turkey, but they also live in Germany. They have also the right to vote. Habermas wrote that there is something like a constitutional nation, but in Eastern Europe cannot create a constitutional nation. We even don't know what is a constitution. We change the we always amend constitutions. Sometimes we add something, sometimes we delete something, and a constitution could be a common base, but in reality it's not the case. And it's a problem because we think in the framework of a national state, and we don't see this cohesion, this power, which brings us together, which keeps us together, and we are kept together by something which is not in harmony with our reality today. And populism mobilizes emotions, feelings, and liberalism had a weakness. Its weakness was that it didn't work on the emotions, on feelings. It always worked only on ratio. Who is interested in feelings? So this is my question lingering in the air. I think that Peter...
Basically, is right saying that we are not lacking a kind of a constitutional patriotism. But when I look at today's Slovak society, I really cannot tell you what keeps it together, what is the glue. I really cannot tell you what unites people of this country, what ideal or what sense do they attach to their future, which they would be able also to define. But when we speak about the state of the Slovak society today, um, we continue in the same manner as under communism or even under the wartime Slovak state. We continue with exclusion. We are still not able to see society um, as inclusive. We have always excluded various minorities from our society. We have never been able to create a political Slovak nation. This is also a shortage, a deficit of our current situation. And there is another thing. When we look at what market capitalism brought to people, this is a topic that we should discuss not one night, but several days. If we speak about the existence of people who see the gap in society opening so much that they are simply not able to see what would be the end with their small pensions, small benefits compared to immense riches on the other side.
What I see now is that we are coming to the conclusion that the fundamental question of the debate, founding question, is wrong. Because it's not the absence of a legacy of citizen-inspired change that kills civic space in our countries, but the capitalism. Well, my intuition says that these two factors work together, and that's why we are in worse situation than other nations of the West, because they have only one factor working against killing citizens. Because when you ask about civic space, then you must ask who will fill it up, and these are citizens, of course. You need citizens to fill it up, and of course, the market, as we see it now, is not pro-citizen factor. And it's not only the market. If you go to the analysis of Daniel Bell, for example, you see that this is the modernism that kills citizenship and self-realization idea. Well, but still, we would like to have a civic society. We would like to fulfill this dream that came to us from the West, from the US, more than 20 years ago. But what I see is that we are more and more aware that when citizens of the Eastern Europe will wake up, they will not look like we would like them to look like. The citizens seems to be quite different persons that we expected. This is not encouraging for Democrats in this part of the world. Well, but are we really hopeless? Well, because it's so sad. We cannot end this debate with this kind of conclusion, because then we will get drunk in the evening, and this will be the only solution for this situation. Well, perhaps somebody? No? No help? Please.
Of course the situation is hopeless, but we have to... situation is hopeless. But that's a motivation to fight. You see, that's a real reason why we have to fight. But I have to contradict our Croatian friend. You see, I don't think democracy and civil society is a complex thing. And of course, it doesn't move only one direction. Maybe we would like and prefer it. I think the elementary in democracy and civil society is that we accept different views too. They may be more liberal, they may be more conservative, they may be more to the left or to the right. But as long as they fit into the frame of respecting human rights, we have to accept them all. And you see, the example you produced was very interesting for me. When you said we're shocked by the movement of 750,000 who asked that the gender marriage matrimony should be established in the Constitution. Now, of course, and I would like to inform that when I was in the Czech Senate, I voted for the introduction in the Czech law of legitimate partnership for homosexual couples. But still, I don't see why it is such a shocking thing if somebody says, I prefer to call a pear, and an apple, and I don't accept that you call a pear an apple and an apple a pear. That means that marriage is one thing, and partnership and homosexual partnership is another thing. Both are respectable forms of people living together, but they are not the same. And I do think we have to some way to listen to other arguments too, not only promoting our own views and think that the civil society has to promote our views. Sometimes the citizens have other views than the elites, even the intellectual elites, and we have to accept it too.
I don't know if any answer is expected from me. I completely agree with you. There is no disagreement here because I think that you are right. We should respect other opinions. Here the problem in Croatia was, first of all, my problem with that is why would 730,000 people worry about should the marriage, should gay people marry or not marry? I'm sure they don't care very much about that, that this is a symptom of something else. But it was that other civil associations, civil rights associations and minority associations tried to present to the parliament argument that it infringes on the right, such a definition of marriage infringes on the right of minorities and human rights, and then posing the question what next comes what next change could come into the constitution if this one passes. This was basically the debate.
Anybody else? Please.
Maybe we should have lights on now because it's very difficult to answer the questions to the person you don't see. It feels like being on the radio program.
Can you see me? Can you see me now?
No, but we hear you.
Okay.
Lights are very strong in our eyes, so could we have lights on, please? Somebody put light on.
Well, I'll begin. My name is Justin Wiedus from the Occupy Wall Street movement in New York City in the United States. And I'm glad that Slavenka brought up the word capitalism because I believe that it was missing in the conversation before. And I think that I believe there's a fundamental tension, if not an incompatibility between global capitalism and local or national democracy, at least in the way that I would like to see it and the way that I think so many young people today are feeling about the lack of democracy, the lack of representation and civic life in their communities. And one thing that I've recognized as having happened in my country is that the civil rights movement was very successful in winning political rights for African Americans, but it wasn't as successful in winning economic rights, helping people out of poverty, to end massive debts, and that lack of economic freedom was only amplified by the financial crisis in 2008. So to where a point where not just African Americans, but many Americans of all races felt a lot of the same struggle. And I think that is what gave birth to the Occupy movement. But what I'm concerned about is that the solution doesn't seem, for many people, to be coming from the right place. So there's a notion that we talk about called solutionism, which is that young people especially have been taught that their freedom will not be guaranteed politically. It won't come from the government, but it will come from corporations. It will come from technology. It will come from innovation. Like there's an application, there's an app for democracy that will fix it, that will make it work. And this flies in the face of what older people understand about struggle for social justice, for progress, especially veterans of the labor movement. But young people, like in my generation, did not grow up with a strong labor movement. And so they don't have a history, they don't know a history of struggle for civil rights, of struggle for justice. And so my question to you is, for young people today, I spoke with high schoolers this morning in a Slovakian school here who said a lot of the same things as young people in the United States, that there is just not a lot of hope for them that this political system will represent their interests. What can you say, what can you give them lessons from history, or maybe lessons from the present, in order to help to build a civic, a political understanding in young people, in order to try to rebuild civic life? Because I believe that that is one of the things that is necessary in order to bolster democracy, is you have to, young people especially, have to have a sense that there is a civic arena, there is a civic life, and they can participate in it. And, you know, voting is just one small part of that. But there's a larger obligation. If you want to be free, if you want more than just certainties, if you want freedoms, how will you get it? What do you say to young people about that?
What would you say to young people about that?
Ez nagyon egyszerű.
It's very simple. Resolve it. Resolve the problems. I am a 60-year-old pensioner who writes novels about women's breasts, and resolve it. Unless you do so, it will remain your problem. Our problem is that at our time we have not resolved it. So now it's up to you.
There is, where's the mic?
Dobrý večer, ja sa volám Laszlo Sigeti.
My name is Laszlo Sigeti. I am editor of the works of the gentleman who just made such a cynical statement. I know that he is not a cynic, he hates it, so you have to take it with a grain of salt. He has different views, but the new generation must really be fundamental or instrumental in resolving this. I sometimes had a feeling as if I were sitting in a society, in a pre-1899 society, when we were discussing what is going to be published by samizdat, etc. But we are outside of the mainstream, and we have neither the space nor the media or the force of conviction which was held by those who, prior to 1989, based on civic rights or based on absence of civic rights obtained to change with the help of the West. Today, civil rights are clear. What you said in your answer, what the prince said in his statement, it's something that was unheard of under dictatorship. It could not be discussed at all. So there have been changes in the area of civil rights. We know what we can ask the state to do. We know what can taint the spirit of democracy in a constitution, but we are not so much concerned about it as we are about economic non-freedom. Economic non-freedom and the resulting deficit of being able to assert oneself is a key question of this space. I do not like to say that civil rights are marginalized, but they are. We seem to think that we do not have to fight on a daily basis for not being deprived of civil rights. We believe that this is the space for civil activities, for civil organizations, media, etc. But the fundamental problem is different. There is a certain feeling of non-freedom within families. In Hungary, 47% of the population are poor. Our situation is not better. I am an ethnic Hungarian living in Slovakia. Tomorrow I am going to speak in the radio because I was present during certain events on the 17th of November in the past, but I told the journalists I'm not going to speak about what happened then, but we should speak about what's going on today. In the past, there were 380,000 people working in agriculture in Slovakia. Today, in the same region, there are only 30,000 of them working in agriculture. And people in villages have nothing to do. They do not know what to do because the agriculture collapsed. Their children go to the West because there is nothing for them to do here. So this is only one of the fragments of our reality. And if one says that capitalism is a different topic, we have to realize that our deficit democracy, our deficit capitalism go hand in hand. One does not exist without the other in this space. And the global philosophy or the philosophy of globalism has taken the better of us, and it leads to the fear in us. You spoke about the French existentialists and the anxiety linked to the feeling of responsibility. But today, I had lunch with Peter, and I have to say that I have a certain sense of responsibility, but I have this this feeling because we live in a universal technological space. And there is a huge open space around us that deprived us of the relevant language to name the things.
And I apologize for speaking so long, but basically I wanted to say to Peter that he's not a cynic at all.
Well, but perhaps there is also another problem. and I'm looking at us of the older generation of Eastern Europe, Eastern Central Europe, and I remember that when we won the war, the fight with previous system, we forget to tell people that democracy is not achieved, that it's something you must achieve every day. That's the difference. You can establish any kind of dictatorship, and it will go on. It's different with democracy, and it's constant fight. And well, I think we never had this kind of an experience here in this part of the world. We know that to provide a bread or sausage for your family, you must work probably every day or something like that, apart if you are a pensioner. But we don't understand that politics, democratic politics, looks like the market. You must work every day. Well, perhaps this is the message that could give us some kind of a hope. I mean, perhaps if people would understand this, if somebody would tell this to our societies, perhaps something would change. I know this is an idealism, but anyway, we know in Eastern Europe, we know that words change reality. Not only reality change words, so perhaps that's the way. If somebody has another, would you, please?
I think I have the obligation to speak in front of the younger generation. I grew up with a joke which most of you know. Dissident joke in the 90s. I heard it for the first time, and that was a simple question. What is the only thing which is worse than communism? You know it, come on. It's like the time after communism. So actually here in this little joke, the problem lies. I'm quoting Boris Budin, one of my favorite, next to Slavenka, one of my favorite Croatian writers and philosophers, who said that post-communism does not have a future. Why? Because the children of communism, who are now the leaders in this time, they never, they grew up and they forgot their childhood. They're not able to reflect, and they're not able to somehow remember this time. So out of this conviction that there is no notion about the past, there cannot be a future. A very brilliant metaphor by Boris Budin. And in my opinion, I have to go to Slavenka and tell her that I don't think that the citizens of Europe, and I'm not dividing Europe into East and West, are afraid. And that is not the fear. The main reason, because they're running under this right-wing umbrella of anti-Semitism and fascism and so on. I think it's more into a direction that the citizens just feel, and I'm here with you, that the citizens feel the lack of credibility of our main institutions, of the pillars of our modern-day societies, of the media, of the political parties, of the corporations. We're here as well. So out of this lack of credibility, which is just a sign of the erosion of institutions, we are in the situation which we are now in, and which Mr. Esterhazy is saying that we should solve it. It's very difficult. I think the younger generation has a really difficult task, and I see it only with the new generation of visionaries. And unfortunately, as I asked before, I don't see those Kreiskys and those Brandts coming up, or those Schwarzenbergs of tomorrow. I don't see them now. And maybe if you see them, if you have any solutions, please tell them, because we're learning, it's a learning process. That's why the forum is here for.
There is only one sentence I would like to add, and that is that what is essential is that young people don't see this problem, and they don't see it And that's a problem. The problem is that they don't see the problem. As soon as there were a problem, why shouldn't they start to search for answers? But they say that what you speak about is a problem of the older generation. It is not a problem of us. And we can speak about postmodern world. There are many escape possibilities. There are many escapes. We can live abroad. And so there are many options for an individual solution, and there are thousands of individual solutions, far more than in 45, 40, 56, 68, because then you couldn't even move out of your country. What you could do was to go from East Slovakia to West Slovakia or from West Slovakia to East Slovakia, but the questions of today are formulated in a different way. Somebody said there is no solution because there is no problem. And I think it was a Wittgenstein's quotation, so I apologize.
This is the problem, in my opinion, that the number of solutions, individual solutions, strategies possible, where most of those people who don't agree with situation in Poland live in London now. And the fact that you can move or you have an impression, then in any case, if things go wrong in Poland, I can go to London. If things go wrong in Hungary, yeah, I can go to Germany or whatever, Turkey. This makes people feel that they don't have to save themselves through saving the society or country.
I want to respond just briefly to the idea about the new generation. This idea about waiting for a new generation, I think that was something Havel believed in, and if I'm not mistaken, all the way until the end. And this is a classic, this comes at least as back as the French Revolution. You know, Robespierre says, "We have raised the temple of liberty with hands still withered by the cross of despotism." And Lenin was acutely aware of that. How do you move from the old world to the new world when the makers of that new world are somehow always already contaminated because they have been formed by that old world? You know, and Havel had all this faith that when a new generation comes of age, a generation that has not been formed by communism, that is free of those complexes, that was not habituated to that kind of passivity and acceptance of absurdity, you know, and cognitive dissonance, you know, and living a lie, then there will be a chance for the creation of new values. I have mixed feelings about this idea myself, because in part because I'm skeptical of this. This evening started out with the mention that, you know, people believe the state will be their savior. I don't think a new generation will be a savior because I don't think there are any saviors, unfortunately. I think we are condemned to live in a world without saviors in which everything will involve a lot of pain and hard work and anguish, and hopefully we can make it a little bit better. But one thing I do think that's worth mentioning in this context, and I hope I don't sound too much like a propagandist, but there is truly a mass formation in Poland now of a younger generation that is devoted specifically to creating a kind of civil society, and that is Krytyka Polityczna. And they are on the left, they are a new left. They are not a post-communist left. I mean, they are literally people who were, you know, in the main too young to have been formed by communism. You know, they have created a notion of the left that I think is a kind of blend of being students of both French postmodern theory on the one hand and 19th century social theory, Marxist and otherwise, on the other. They have gone back to what is essentially a kind of classic idea of the 19th century Russian intelligentsia, about the engagé intelligentsia. They've looked back to, you know, social theory pre-Leninism, both Marx pre-Lenin and other social thinkers, you know, pre-Lenin, you know, and they've kind of run that through a certain filter of reading Derrida, Foucault, Judith Butler, and Zizek, you know, and that is a kind of, that's a unique combination. They're devoted to creating a kind of engagé intelligentsia, and one can agree or disagree with certain positions on stances, but they have worked very hard to create a kind of public forum for debate. You know, there are lots of young people who are very kind of internet savvy. I think it's tremendously impressive what they've done. I think it's something that makes me feel very hopeful about what this region has to give. It's something that I don't think we have in the States. And let me just tell you a brief anecdote to highlight that. So the founder of Kritika Polityczna, who is still the kind of leader of sorts, Sławek Sierakowski, came to Yale, where I teach, for a semester a year and a half ago, or maybe 2 years ago. And he, of course, is now a major public figure in Poland. He was totally unknown at Yale. He very loyally came to all my classes, which was very sweet of him. Now, my American students at Yale, of course, had no idea who he was. And it was only slowly, as the semester went on, that it started to occur to them that perhaps he wasn't actually a student at Yale. But then they couldn't really figure out what he was doing in my classes. And at one point, I was teaching a seminar on phenomenology, and we were reading Husserl. And we were going through this very kind of difficult and technical and somewhat obscure procedure that Husserl has for getting to epistemological certainty, you know, in which you have to kind of bracket any questions about whether this bottle that you see really exists, or whether it's just a projection of your consciousness. You put that in brackets and you focus on a precise description of the contents of your consciousness. This is, I mean, it's very difficult for me to understand, and I teach it, and of course was very difficult for my students. And suddenly Sławek says, "Oh, I do the phenomenological reduction every third day." And my students are looking at him like what is he possibly talking about? This is this kind of like philosophical German esoteria, you know, and we're never going to use this in our life. And Sławek said, "Oh, but you just have to extrapolate. I mean, it's basically the same thing we do when we're trying to think about racism, or we're trying to think about homophobia. You have to step back and say, okay, can I bracket, can I put aside what is real and what is not real, and what is a projection of my consciousness and what might objectively exist and have a mind-independent reality? Can I put aside that question and think for a moment, can I just right now describe exactly what I see?" And for my students, that was a revelation. It was a revelation not because it helped them technically to understand Husserl, you know, and not because Sławek understood Husserl necessarily better than they did. It was a revelation because the idea that you could take these ideas we were reading about in books, ideas conceived by dead people who seemed very remote to them, and actually try them on and see what you could possibly do with this or use in your real life to somehow engage with the world. That was the revelation. And they had no idea who he was, or that he was a public figure, or that he had a mass movement. By the end of the semester, my American students were following him around campus, and they were asking me questions like, when we graduate, can we go to Poland and work for Sławek? So I think there is something special here.
Welcome. Well, this is of course optimistic story, but I am very big fan of the optimistic stories. But do you know how many people are there in Kritika Polityczna? I love Sławek. I support them for years. There are few hundred people throughout the country. This is This is very similar to dissident movement under communism, which is extremely important, of course, in a given time, can be crucial for history. But still, this is not a social movement. And the problem is, we have very strong social movements on anti-democratic side. The paradox of Polish experience is, and I think of Croatian the experience as well, is that, and Hungarian perhaps, is that anti-democrats feel much better in democratic environment than Democrats. And they are much more active. And that's what we see also, also in North Africa. If that the rule is real, if that's the true, what should Democrats do to preserve democracy against those who feel much better in this environment? That's what we saw. I mean, perhaps we should take under consideration what happened in what's going on in North Africa. There were moderately enlightened regimes, but not democratic and no rule of law. Society wanted more freedom, more rule of law, more democracy. Now what happens? It turns interested the situation in countries like Tunisia, for example, where people say, well, that was perhaps the dictatorship was not that bad. And well, this is something we should consider as a bad, the worst scenario for us as well. Will people not say one day, well, it was a nice experiment with democracy and the civil society, but it doesn't work. Let's turn to enlightened autocrat. Are you aware of that? Is this the scenario you see in your countries? Let's start from Hungary, perhaps.
A felvilágosodó autokrácia, abszolutizmus vždy bol veľmi príťažlivý.
Absolutism was always very attractive. And what you are describing here, yes, that's our reality, that's what we have discussed. The question of responsibility or the lack of responsibility leads to a situation where a structure that has certain features of autocracy seems to be convenient. I am not asking why our government acts in this manner. Governments are idiotic, and even if they are not idiotic, they are the way they are. And the question is not why does the government behave in this way, but the question is why does our country behave in this way. So it's not the face of the government, but the face of the country that is at issue. And everybody speaks about sovereignty today. Such countries that have a tradition in this respect are able to solve this problem. Hungary is not able to solve this problem well because its history was always turning around the issue of sovereignty. If we have sovereignty, we are not strong. If we are losing sovereignty, this is an adverse situation, and this can be taken advantage of by populists. And our society is exposed to populism, and the thing that you are describing here is already present in our country. I do not quite understand um, the what are individual states of democracy. We are not familiar with it. We are familiar with dictatorship, but there are also different forms of dictatorships, like Greek junta. And a Greek colleague said that their life under military junta was unbearable. I asked why, and he said because my poetry collection was only issued in 2,000 copies. What I want to say is that dictatorship has thousands paces, thousand variations. And what we see today in Hungary is that people have the impression they have to um, adjust, and we also witness self-censorship similar to the one under Kadar. Uh, True, there are no lists of the authors who are to be banned, but people have a feeling they should adapt or adjust. There is a media law which does exist, although it is not enforced. But as a result, owners of big broadcasting radio and TV companies are afraid, and they feel that they should be very careful because the situation is similar to Chekhov's play, that if there is a rifle hanging on the wall, sooner or later somebody will use it to shoot. And in 90% of programs, we see pro-government speakers, representatives, and the opposition only gets 10% of broadcasting space. So the immunity or self-defense capability of society is weakening. And the result is, and this does not apply only to my generation, which has experience with dictatorship, but what is really the worst thing is that we can see 30 years old kids who are kids, even at 30, who feel that they should exercise self-censorship, and self-censorship is the most destructive factor in the culture of our countries. If there is self-censorship, everybody can or must lose, and the result must be humiliation and loss. Sometimes they are, or there seem to be petty things, because nobody says that there is something you cannot speak about, but people themselves have a feeling that it would be better not to use this kind of qualification or referring to things they do not use certain terms. Under communism, we were playing the game of reading between the lines. We were using synonyms, metaphors, and yes, in a dictatorship, this is a dignified mode of defense because there is a risk involved. And also, if you delete a word of what I have said or written, there is something that you can read between the lines. But it seems that even today we are playing a similar game, and that we have again accepted to play this humiliating self-censorship game. But I believe that we should end on a more positive note, but if this is the case, then somebody else should take over.
To all of you is for more optimistic final statements. Rudolf?
Ja,
I don't remember when I was an optimist. I am a skeptic all my life. So how can I give this torso of Slovak Democrats gathering here in this palais, how can I give them a toast of hope? I had a friend in the past who used to tell me that the situation is a catastrophe, but there is hope. It's not hopeless. So maybe it is the reality that we are in a closed space and we are intellectuals or intellectuals who are sensitive to their status. And I think that in Slovakia, it's very obvious, very visible what you see. It is not due to the self-censorship. We are not so far yet. Maybe we are coming to it, but we had already had that situation under Mečiar. So what we see is rather a resignation of the intellectuals, of the intellectual community, and they, together with civil activists, who till Mečiar was defeated, and that result was achieved with the help of civil activists. So I think this community, after experience with our government, and there was another, I mean, I speak about our government where I was also a minister, the intellectual community resigned. They simply somehow understood that there is not such a huge difference between the former politicians and the incoming politicians, the so-called democratic politicians, so that there is not such a difference. And today, this word intellectual, in our market society, we are a society in market capitalism, is a notion which has no value. So, and the politicians also know that, and then they don't get nervous when an intellectual makes a comment which is outside expected. But the negative consequences that this societal demand after having an intellectual doesn't exist. You see it in our media, and we see a deficit of democratic, liberal media which could give society, let's say, the spirit of doubt, but also the spirit of hope. And we are maybe in a more sad situation in Slovakia, but as I have said, it's not a hopeless situation.
Chance, please.
This is my last chance to be optimistic. Yeah.
We shouldn't drink too much tonight because tomorrow we must take part in this conference, in this forum.
But why do you want to bring this to the optimistic conclusion? I don't know. I don't think that the task of myself as a writer or journalist or this panel or this whole meeting is to conclude anything. I think it's enough if we present situation as we see it, as if we analyze it and ask important questions. And I think this is what we did tonight, raised a lot of important questions and given some analysis. But because you want something optimistic, I will tell you something optimistic. I came up with something optimistic. Interestingly enough, as nobody mentioned capitalism, nobody also mentioned, speaking about young people, not even young people who stood up and talked tonight here, mentioned unemployment and did not mention that majority of, in many countries, unemployment, that majority of unemployed in many countries with high number of unemployment are young.
And this is optimistic, yeah?
And this is very optimistic. Why?
For
because
people.
these people, the society that has unemployed children, so to say, is cutting a branch on which it is sitting. It means, for me, I see optimism, I see hope there, because these kids will have to do something in order to get out of that situation. And that's something, because we are talking about huge numbers, we are talking about many countries, that might be something, but they have to get out of this situation. They can't sit with 45 or 35 in the house with the parents who, nota bene, have very small pensions, if they have any. So there is some material, so to say, for a social change. I see it as optimistic. That's optimism I can give you.
Sure. When you fall down, new energy comes. And please, well, a lot of, please take the mic. A lot of hope used to come to Europe from the US. So the last chance in Yale University professor that will provide us with some optimistic message from the end of the debate.
Okay,
Please.
I'm happy to do that. Yes. Well, my childhood hero, Abby Hoffman, liked to say that democracy is not something you believe in or a place you hang your hat. It's something you do. You participate. Well, one of the things you do, and as Slavenka said, we didn't really get to media, but is you participate in conversation. And conversation is an art, you know, and it's not just about posting things on the internet, and it's not just about people giving lectures. It's actually about different people coming into the same place and talking about difficult questions. And it's deciding, you know, what is going to be the boundaries of acceptable discourse, you know, and what is going to be outside those boundaries. And it's grappling with people who have different ideas. And that art of conversation, I think, is at the center of what civil society is supposed to be. And I think the fact that all of you on a Friday night have now sat through 3 hours of us all having an unscripted conversation here in Bratislava is a tremendously hopeful sign for the future of democracy here.
Thank you very much. That was perfect. Now we can share our problems with our colleagues who will take part in debates tomorrow, and after tomorrow they have 2 days more to answer these questions we raised. And I hope, and this is extremely optimistic, they will be able to do it. Thank you very much for this debate. Thank you, and see you tomorrow.